When she first spoke, she didn't look at her parents. She stood in front of a metal gate. Behind it sat a dog, and she whispered its name. That was on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The sky was gray. The parking lot in front of the animal shelter smelled of damp concrete. Amelia was 6 years old, and she had never spoken a single word in her entire life. Not to her mother, not to her father, not at the special needs center she had been attending for 2 years. Not at night when she was alone in her room. Not a word, not a sound, nothing. Her mother, Sandra, says Amelia was born a perfectly healthy baby. Everything seemed normal. She drank, slept, opened her eyes, but she didn't cry. Not once. Not at birth. Not in the first few nights. The midwife had mentioned it briefly, almost as an aside. She had said that some babies are simply quiet. Sandra had believed it. She had wanted to believe it. By 18 months, it was clear that something was different. Other children in the playgroup were already saying, "Mommy, no." Amelia sat on the floor and looked at her hands, not absent-minded, very attentive, but silent. The pediatrician said to wait and see. Some children develop later. At 2 years old, still nothing. The doctor referred her to a speech therapist. The speech therapist referred her to a child psychologist. The child psychologist referred her to a specialized clinic in the next town. This took months, then even more months. The diagnosis that finally came was long and had several parts. Sandra read it 3 times. She understood most of the words, but she sat with the paper on her lap and didn't know what to do with it. Her husband, Peter, drove from appointment to appointment, from doctor to doctor the whole time. He asked factual questions. He wrote things down. In the evenings, when Amelia was asleep, they sometimes just sat next to each other. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. The therapist said Amelia wasn't deaf. Her hearing was perfect. She reacted to sounds. She turned her head when someone opened the door. She flinched when a car braked sharply outside. She heard everything. She just didn't say anything. The final diagnosis was severe selective mutism in conjunction with a pervasive developmental disorder. The doctor said, "It's possible she'll learn to speak eventually. It's also possible she won't." No one knows. Peter had nodded. Sandra had looked at a stain on the wall of the consultation room. The years passed. Amelia grew. She wasn't an unhappy child, that must be said. She sometimes laughed, a quiet, short laugh, almost inaudible. She liked certain textures, soft fabric, smooth wooden surfaces. She liked it when Sandra brushed her hair, but she didn't speak. At the special needs center, she was the quietest child. Her caregiver, Ms. Langer, said, "Amelia observes everything very closely. She notices things that others miss. If a bird flew to the window outside, Amelia saw it first. She turned her head before anyone else noticed." At home, Amelia had had a habit for about a year. Every morning before Sandra took her to the center, she took a colored pencil and drew the same thing on a small piece of paper, a dog, a sitting dog from the front. Small ears, large head, simple lines. The drawings were hardly different, always the same dog. Sandra had a stack of them in a drawer. At some point, she counted them. There were dozens. She asked Mrs. Langer if Amelia also drew dogs at the facility. Mrs. Langer said, "Yes, always the same one. Nobody knew why. There was no dog at home. There was no dog in the family." Sandra liked dogs, but they had never had one. Peter once said, half to himself, "Maybe she just wants a dog." Sandra was silent for a moment, then said she wanted something. The idea of the animal shelter came from Mrs. Langer. She had heard that a nearby animal shelter sometimes invited school classes and small groups, not for extensive tours, just to look around. She thought it might be good for Amelia. She thought it might be good just to look around. What would happen? Sandra wasn't sure. She knew Amelia. New places were often too much, too many noises, too many impressions. Amelia would withdraw into herself, become even quieter, which seemed almost impossible, but happened nonetheless. Ms. Langer said, "We'll go inside for a bit. If it gets too much, we'll come right back out." It was a Tuesday. The morning was gray. The three of them arrived, Sandra, Ms. Langer, and Amelia. Amelia was wearing a thin jacket, blue with small white polka dots. She held Sandra's hand on the way to the front door. Not tightly, but she didn't let go. Inside, it was immediately noisy. The paddling started right in the entrance area, a deep, rhythmic paddling from the left, then a higher, excited one from the right, then several at once. The walls were concrete, the floor was tiled, everything was damp. It smelled of disinfectant and something warm underneath, something hard to describe. The staff member who greeted them was named Karen. She was friendly. She spoke loudly because it was noisy. She briefly explained how the yard was divided. Large dogs on the left, small ones on the right. A passageway ran down the middle. Amelia stopped by the entrance door. Sandra looked at her. Amelia looked ahead into the passageway. Her hand was still in Sandra's. Her face showed nothing discernible, only the attentiveness, that very precise, very quiet attentiveness that Sandra knew so well. Karen asked quietly if everything was all right. Sandra said, "We'll just see." They walked slowly into the passageway. Metal gates to the right and left, the dogs behind them. Some jumped up and down, some barked, some looked through the gate. One, a large light-colored dog, put his paws against the gate and looked directly at Amelia. Amelia paused briefly. She looked at the dog. Then she continued walking, not because she was afraid, just onward. Sandra noticed that Amelia was pulling, not strongly, but she was pulling. She wanted to go further into the passageway, further back. It was quieter at the end of the passageway. The noise from the front could still be heard, but muffled. The kennels here were a bit bigger. The dogs here barked less. Some were lying down. Some were standing. In the last kennel on the left, a dog sat in the far corner. He was medium-sized, dark brown, almost black, with a white spot on his chest. He sat on the tiled floor and looked straight ahead. He didn't bark. He didn't get up. He was simply there. Amelia stopped in front of his kennel. She let go of Sandra's hand. She had never done that before, not in unfamiliar rooms, not in unknown places. Sandra felt her hand suddenly empty. She didn't move. Mrs. Langer, who was standing a step behind them, also held her breath. Karen said softly, almost whispering, "This is Bruno. He's been here for 4 months. He's very shy. He rarely comes to the front." Amelia stood in front of the kennel. Both her hands hung at her sides. She looked at Bruno. Bruno sat in the corner. He looked back. Seconds passed, maybe 30, maybe a minute. The sound of balls being played further up the corridor could still be heard. But here, in this section, it was quiet. Bruno then moved very slowly. He stood up. That was unusual, Karen said later. He usually stood in his corner for hours. He didn't come forward, not for visitors, not for the caregivers he didn't yet know. But then he came, step by step, very calmly. He raised his head slightly and walked to the railing. There he stopped. His breathing was calm. Amelia's breathing was calm. They looked at each other. The railing was between them. Sandra stood a few steps back. She watched her daughter, the slender back in the blue jacket, the silent hands. Amelia leaned forward slightly, just a little. Her forehead came close to the railing, then she opened her mouth. Sandra paused briefly. She didn't know why. And then very quietly, Amelia's lips formed a word. She whispered his name. Bruno. Karen stood behind Sandra. She had heard it. She put a hand to her mouth and said nothing. Mrs. Langer was standing further back. She had heard it too. She looked away briefly and then back again. The dog immediately calmed down. He slowly moved his tail. Then he stretched his head forward and came closer to the fence. Amelia raised her hand, her fingers gently touching him. They stayed like that. The girl and the dog, calm, close together. Sandra didn't move. She just watched. Mrs. Langer took out her cell phone and filmed briefly without sound. On the way back, no one spoke much. Amelia sat in the back of the car and looked out the window. At home, Sandra sat down at the table and called Peter. She simply said, "Please, come home. I'll explain it to you later." Peter came. Sandra told her everything slowly, pausing. He just listened. He didn't interrupt her. When she was finished, the kitchen was quiet. Then Peter asked, "Did Mrs. Langer film that?" Sandra said, "Yes." Peter looked at the table. "May I see it?" Mrs. Langer sent the video that same evening. It was shaky. The sound was barely there. You could see Amelia's back, the cage, and Bruno behind it. You could see Amelia lean forward slightly, and then, if you were very observant, right at the edge of the frame, you could see her lips move. Peter watched the video once, then again. Then he put his phone down on the table and looked to the side. Sandra was sitting next to him. Neither of them put anything down. They were just sitting there. After a while, Peter said, "We'll get him." Sandra nodded. They called the animal shelter the next day. Karen answered. She already knew the voice. Sandra asked about Bruno. Karen said, "Bruno is still there." They said, "They'll come on the weekend, on Friday." Ms. Langer shared the video in a small online group for educators who worked with nonverbal children. She wrote little about it, just, "What we need isn't a method. It's someone who is just as silent as we are." A member of the group shared it, then someone else, then someone with a wider reach. Within 2 days, 18,000 people had seen the video. Within a week, over 100,000 people wrote comments in many languages. Many wrote about their own children, about moments when something had clicked, about animals that had been able to achieve something that humans hadn't. Most of the comments were short, some just a single sentence. The animal shelter was mentioned. Someone asked how they could help. Karen answered briefly and factually. The donations started coming in. In the following weeks, donations arrived from 11 different countries. The animal shelter used the money for a new heating system in the back and for additional care hours. A journalist requested an interview. Sandra initially refused, but after a few weeks she said, "Yes, briefly, just by phone and without showing Amelia's face." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Sandra spoke calmly. She explained little. She simply described what had happened. The journalist asked at the end, "What has changed?" Sandra thought for a moment, then said she was now drawing a different dog. Bruno moved in with them on a Saturday in April. He arrived in a transport crate. He slowly stepped out and looked around. The apartment was unfamiliar to him. He stopped in the middle of the living room. Amelia sat on the floor. She waited. Bruno looked at her. Then he slowly came over. He lay down next to her, not on her lap, just beside her. His side touched her knee. Amelia put her hand on his back, and they sat like that for a while. Peter stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't film. He simply let it be. In the weeks that followed, Amelia didn't speak any more than before. That has to be said honestly. Bruno wasn't a switch you could flip. Amelia continued to be silent most of the time at the facility at home with strangers, but with Bruno, she sometimes spoke very quietly. Single words, his name, sometimes here, sometimes simple things. Sandra wrote them down in the same little notebook she had started in the meantime. After a year, it had entries. After 2 years, Bruno sleeps on a blanket next to Amelia's bed. He had been there from the beginning, not because they had arranged it that way. He had simply lain down there and hadn't left. Amelia is 9 now. She still doesn't speak much, but she talks to Bruno almost every day, sometimes to Sandra, less often to Peter, but it does happen. The therapists, they say it's been a long road. It's always been a long road. The small notebook lies in the kitchen drawer. Sandra sometimes reads it, not for any particular reason, just because. The first entry is short, the date, and then just one word, Bruno. Sometimes the first word isn't the most important. Sometimes it's simply the beginning, a sign that someone was ready, that someone listened, not with words, just with their body, with their silence, with their presence. Bruno hadn't asked if Amelia could speak. He had simply waited, and she had told him something she had never told anyone else. His name. That was enough.